Ooh, but I just passed a frisson on me.
Well, for those of you who didn't understand that, Andy called it chill, and he's cold right now. I'll ruin the surprise already. Jeez.
Ow. Yeah, Shane and I sometimes use different pronunciations and grammar differently from others because we speak the same variety of English, Cajun English. Growing up in rural Avoyelles Parish, we knew that our community was different from people in North Louisiana.
So first, 45 minutes north of home, people's parents and grandparents don't speak French like ours do.
Second, we give distances in minutes rather than in miles. We often roll our R's in words like frisson and boucherie.
And we sometimes use non-English words.
What we're doing is using non-mainstream structures in our conversation that make up the dialect differences in our dialect and any other. These vary in terms of pronunciation, grammar, social behavior, and eye gaze. These are also slightly different from the mainstream, which is used by the media and in the classroom.
So looking back, Andy and I can appreciate our language, our dialect. So whether it was the sentence structure, pragmatic social skills, and vocabulary that made up our dialect, our language, all of these forge a specific language fingerprint that fits specifically to us. And so whether it's how long I look at somebody in a conversation, or if I say something along the lines of, "Are you going to get down?"
For those of you that didn't get that semantic difference, get down literally means get out of the car, like at somebody's house.
That's me if you didn't really see that too well. And so we have all these semantic differences. And so what is our dialect? What is language? What is everything? So let's first starting out by saying, well, what does society think about dialect? And how do we perceive it?
Well, I have a not so funny story to tell about that. When I was in high school, in algebra class, most of the class was out on a field trip and we were chatting with our teacher about college. I said something to the effect of, I had went to Baton Rouge to visit LSU. Well, she quickly corrected me and said,
had gone.
I looked at her like, what? She said, now Andy, you cannot become a doctor sounding like that. Now a woman that I had known growing up had taken our own dialect and then stereotyped me. Well, it wasn't until years later that I realized that these structures were all acceptable and dialect appropriate.
Well, why do we use dialect?
By using our dialect, we're able to communicate to our listener our group identity, specifically here, our Cajun identity, or your own identity.
So what does society think about these dialects? Well, they associate them with negative stigmas and stereotypes. And so sometimes they can be viewed as hardworking or lazy, rich or poor, educated or uneducated. So our second question is what is happening to dialects in Louisiana today?
Right, so through our research and training at LSU, even though speakers use higher rates of non-mainstream structures and forms, they're actually moving more towards the mainstream, which affects its vivacity and overall preservation.
So let's jump back a little bit. We use language every day, so whether it's having a conversation with your best friend or giving a presentation like we are today, let's see if we can come up with a good definition for it. And so cue boring definition on slide, go. Okay, so here we go. A linguistic code that is based on a set of rules in which people of a certain group communicate their basic wants and needs.
Yeah, so languages are essentially divided by political and or geographical boundaries. If you think of the United States and Mexico with Spanish and English, even though there's a lot of overlap, this was divided by that political boundary. If you think of French and English in Louisiana, these two were pretty much separated by geographical limitations like bayous and rivers and swamps that pretty much kept those dialects isolated from each other. So prior researchers have investigated Cajun French as well as Louisiana Creole French. In addition, we have looked at, there we go, Southern White English, Cajun English, and African American English.
So now let's see if we can come up with another boring definition of dialect. And look at that.
So yeah, if these two have the same definition, could we then say that we acquire language and dialect in the same way?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so now how do we shift from a baby babbling to producing coos and ga's to being able to use sarcasm like, Shane, you look nice tonight, versus, Shane, you look nice tonight.
Well, well, well. So language acquisition is a beautiful thing. You start as an infant babbling, cooing, guying, from being able to label one-word responses like ball, bubbles, to joining two words together, to being able to imitate anything. So sometimes mom and dad might say something that little baby might start to say too, and that could be a bad thing. But overall, it's a really good thing. And so as children grow, as speech-language pathologists, this is what we see all the time. We watch these kids grow along with their families, and they become pretty savvy language users. And so sometimes they can be able to do something pretty abstract to, well, Mr. Shayne, why aren't you married? And why don't you have kids too? Why are you hairy? Why are you ugly? And so these are pretty things, I hear these all the time. This is on a weekly basis, so I'm pretty immune to them by now. But yeah, this is what happens when you become a good language user.
Yeah, we essentially learn language and dialect through other language users by modeling and reinforcement.
So let's listen to some sound clips to see what kind of variables we can discover by just listening to someone's voice.
I just called to tell you that we went fishing all day today, and we had a basket full of fish. And Bert decided to take off the basket hanging off the side of the boat, and all the faculty got out. So, yeah, I'm not that happy. Anyway, so no fish fry this weekend. That's all canceled, all thanks to Bert.
All right. So let's make some assumptions about this listener.
We'll start off easy for you guys.
Okay. So how many of you, by show of hands, think that this was a male? Okay.
Good.
How about female? Right. Good job.
Nice job.
Okay. How many of you think that this speaker is from the north? Raise your hand. Okay. How about the south?
Two for two. Yeah, I like this already.
Good job. Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another clip.
Andy, it's on. Hey, I was just giving you a call. There's a man, he came to the mill today. He's old freshman, old took man. But anyway, he wanted me to make him more bamboo duck calls up. So I'm going to make him one up with a little saucy corn on the side. Be good to go. I'll have you later, Bob. All right.
Also, if you couldn't tell, these are two voicemails, and the speakers definitely consented to doing this. All right, so how many of you think that this is a mainstream speaker?
Haha, good job.
Non-mainstream? Yeah. Right. How many of you think he's from North Louisiana? Yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
South Louisiana? Good job again. Okay. Let's make another step. How many of you think that he is a speaker of Southern White English? Okay, Cajun English.
Whoa, right. There we go.
Yeah. Okay, great. So after you've heard these clips, we kind of made some assumptions, and we figured out their dialects by analyzing their sound inventories, as well as stress, pitch, intonation, as well as their vocabulary and some grammar too.
So we took all of these variables and grouped them together. Now, whenever you heard these clips, did you group any of them into those stereotypes like we described earlier? Did you classify any of them as hardworking or lazy or rich or poor? So let's see, what does this do for us as listeners? Let's talk about social identity to get a little bit more info.
Yeah, so our social identity is how we connect with our group identity. This is the group that shares similar customs, beliefs, values, and often the same dialect.
And so, like we talked about, we group these into certain stereotypes, like hardworking, lazy, rich, or poor. And we kind of hear these variables associated with their dialect, and sometimes we tend to group them, even though we don't mean to. And so, social identity is directly influenced by dialect, which overall is influenced by community, culture, and yourselves. All of this makes up who you are.
Yeah, I have some friends that live in Palermo, Italy, and when you ask them what they are, they're real quick to say that they're Sicilian over Italian. If you ask us, we're likely to say that we're Cajun. These group identities are tied so strongly into the dialects that we speak.
And so we use our dialect to project our social identity, to fit in sometimes. And so why do we have negative stereotypes associated with dialects if we are all dialect users who are just using our dialect to project our social identity and to fit in?
Right, so two reasons. The first is that these misconceptions are based off of negative stereotypes that are typically historically based. Think of when you're giving a presentation, you tend to use less of those non-mainstream forms so that you avoid sounding uneducated. There are, of course, other variables too, but this one's way too common. Secondly, some have more variation from the mainstream compared to others.
So what do we do as dialect users when we come into a communicative situation with someone who doesn't share our same dialect?
Well, we use a nifty process called code switching. This is where you take certain sounds, grammar, and even sentences from one dialect and use it in another during conversation.
Now, we don't use these 100% of the time. We take into consideration our audience. And so what Andy and I are doing today, we're giving a presentation, we're code switching to meet your expectations, to more have a common ground to neutralize. And so we do this so that we sound more educated, so that we sound maybe rich, so maybe that we fit in with everyone who is our audience.
Right, it's what we do as listeners that affect why we code switch. Again, we look down on people and view them as being inferior. It's now time to stop, look back, and say it's acceptable because these non-mainstream and mainstream forms are all dialect appropriate.
So let's recap a little bit. We use our dialect to project our social identity, and we can also make basic assumptions about social identity based on the variables of dialect.
Overall, those rates of non-mainstream features and structures are decreasing and moving more towards the mainstream.
So what are we doing to preserve dialect?
Well, we need to teach acceptance. Teach that it's okay that we speak differently from other people and that other people speak differently from us.
Empower the younger generation. Use your dialect to teach that language acquisition that we talked about earlier. Teach them that it's okay to use your dialect.
Remember that preserving your dialect is preserving you and preserving your heritage.
So what's our idea? Our idea is to empower dialect use, to take away all of those negative stigmas and stereotypes associated with them. Instead, use this as a learning point and a growing point. Use your dialect.